and I'd like to welcome you to the second of our Women's Rights in Healthcare webinars. Really, thank you very much for attending. I'm Suz White, and I'm head of Leigh Clinical Negligence team. And I'm delighted to be hosting what I'm sure will be a really fascinating insight into campaigning for women's rights in healthcare, breaking taboos, and the challenges which that creates. So if you missed our first webinar, which was about outcomes from the Cumberland Review, that webinar is now available to watch on our YouTube channel. A recording of this session will also be available. So let's get down to the main event. And I'd like to introduce you to our two really fantastic speakers, really inspiring women. We've just been chatting. I'm so sorry not to be able to meet them in person, as I'm sure you are. Amika George is a student at Cambridge University who at the age of 17 started the Free Periods campaign from her bedroom to end period poverty in the UK. After reading about children missing school as they're unable to afford menstrual products, Amika started an online movement, organised a protest in London, attended by over 2,000 people, and launched a legal campaign. In 2019, her campaign successfully persuaded the UK government to provide free menstrual products in all English schools and colleges from January 2020. She has received global recognition for her campaigning work, including receiving a Goalkeepers Campaign Award by Bill and Melinda Gates. In conjunction with the United States, she was listed by Time magazine as one of the most 25 influential teenagers in the world. She has launched the next phase of Free Periods campaigning to ensure that every child worldwide has access to education uninhibited by their period, and working to delegitimize, sorry, that's a bit of a word, menstruation and eradicate the taboo around periods. I believe Amika has also written a book, which we believe is out in January. We've just been chatting about that, called Make It Happen and How to Be an Activist. My second guest is Diane Danzebrink, is a menopause expert and a professional therapist with nurse training. She's a menopause counsellor in a private practice and the founder of not-for-profit organisation menopausesupport.co.uk, which offers menopause education, information and advice and support to the public workshops, and a private Facebook community and menopause awareness training and consultancy to business and organisations. In 2018, Diane founded the national MakeMenopauseMatter campaign, which has already ensured menopause has been added to the new RSA curriculum in secondary education, and continues to campaign for mandatory menopause education for GPs and better menopause support in the workplace. She's regularly interviewed on TV and radio and has appeared on BBC Breakfast, ITV and Sky News, as well as Lorraine This Morning. Both national and regional BBC radios. She's also written about menopause for both the Telegraph and The Guardian, and contributed to several books. These women are both hugely impressive, who've done great things to raise awareness of the women's health issues. I'm sure you agree. So first of all, Amika, please tell us about your Free Periods campaign. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Suzanne. I really appreciate that introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me. I was just telling Suzanne and Diane that I actually did work experience at Leigh about almost 5 years ago when I was very young. But thank you so much for inviting me to this amazing webinar. I'm really excited. So yeah, I thought I would just give a kind of overview of what free periods is and period poverty, and how my work has tried to tackle the period taboo, and I suppose reframe periods as not only something that we should be celebrating and rather than being ashamed or embarrassed of, but we should also see them as a political issue, in that the lack of access to menstrual products is a huge inhibitor to gender equality, and it's a human right to have, I believe it's a human right to have access to menstrual products in the same way that we have toilet paper or soap in any kind of public toilet or space. So kind of rewind to 2017 in April, when I was 17 years old, and I was at school. I went to a school in North London, and I suppose I lived a very monotonous life of school and homework and friends and family, and I think I'm quite privileged in that I've never kind of even thought about where my period products would come from. I thought they just come, you know, they just appear in a drawer, my parents would pay for them, and I'd never really doubted that. And then that all changed one morning when I was having breakfast, and as all teenagers tend to do, scrolling through our phones, and I saw this news article that flashed on my screen, and it said that girls in the UK couldn't afford menstrual products and were missing school for sometimes a week every month because of that. The article actually made headlines because a charity called Freedom for Girls was providing free period products for schoolgirls in Kenya who couldn't afford them. And they then were contacted by a couple of schools in Leeds who said, actually, we've noticed a pattern of absence in our school records that show that the same thing is happening right here in Leeds. And that contrast really shocked a lot of people. I think that there's this kind of pervasive myth around the UK and the fact that there's no such thing as poverty, and we're the fifth largest economy, and you know, we're always kind of framed in this dichotomy in opposition to kind of quote unquote developing countries like Kenya. But then an issue like period poverty, where schoolgirls in the UK are unable to go to school because they can't afford a tampon in the same way that that can happen in any country. I think that really brings that issue to light, that this is a huge issue and there is a real serious level of abject poverty in this country if girls are literally too poor to go to school. And these girls, some testimonies were done soon after that showed that girls were forcing themselves to go to school using kind of makeshift alternatives, things like using toilet paper, newspaper, socks, t-shirts, whatever they could get their hands on, just to be able to go to school and get an education, which I just didn't believe was an issue in the 21st century. So I did a bit more research into it. I found that it was just something that not many people were talking about because not many people were aware of it. When I asked my friends and family, they were all kind of disgusted, and everyone kind of said the same thing, which is what my initial reaction was as well, that, oh, like, I'm sure the government will step up and start providing them for free, or at least they would condemn it and, you know, increase school budgets to cover the costs. And I waited a couple of days, nothing came. I emailed an MP who raised it in Parliament, and I think Justine Greening, who's the Education Secretary at the time, she refused to answer the question. So,
Wow.
Yeah, it seemed like a very kind of intense.
I thought she would have. Wow.
I think a few weeks later it was raised again, and she did answer and said that firstly, she made a kind of comment that inadvertently blamed the parents for saying it's the parents' responsibility to find the money, and then said it's also the schools' responsibility to find money in their budgets. But we all know, obviously, that schools in the UK are massively underfunded, and it's just not, there just isn't extra cash for pads and tampons. So I decided to start a social media campaign. It started as a petition on change.org and then kind of expanded beyond that. The idea was that I said the government has a responsibility to provide the products for free in schools in the same way that they do toilet paper or soap. And I think a lot of people had seen that same article that I had seen. They'd felt that same anger that I'd felt, and also the kind of disbelief at Justine Greening's dismissal of the issue. So it really took off. A lot of people signed the petition in a couple of weeks. I think it got over 2,000 signatures, and then it kind of grew from there, and it became more of a social media movement. I did a lot of interviews on TV and articles and that kind of thing. But what I found most incredible throughout the process was just the level of enthusiasm and passion from young activists, so mainly teenagers, either my age, sometimes as young as 11 or 12 years old, who were posting on social media, sharing the free periods petition, sharing it with their schools. You know, I was getting messages from 11-year-olds saying, I'm so passionate about this. I've started volunteering with a charity. I've donated. I've put the link in my school's newsletter. What more can I do? And I was just, I think, completely overwhelmed by that level of enthusiasm and passion. And what was even more shocking was in contrast to the government's kind of dismissal and complete radio silence. In about, I think it was in May, when the general election was called in 2017, I emailed all the political parties and I said, this is a real opportunity to talk about period poverty and do something about it. And in the end, the Green Party, the Women's Equality Party and the Liberal Democrats all made a pledge in their election manifestos to end period poverty in schools, and then Labour made a similar pledge, kind of committing, I think it was £10 million to addressing the issue too. But obviously it was only the Conservative government who could actually make the change and create the policy. So the campaign obviously continued over 2017, and then the next
Did they not react to that then at that stage, Amika?
They didn't. So my own MP is a Conservative MP, and
Who's that? Name and shame.
His name is Matthew Offord. I emailed him, I think 6 times in that first year of the campaign, and the 7th time I said in December. I think I emailed him at the beginning of December, and I said on the 20th of this month, which is the day that all state schools in the UK break up for the Christmas holidays, we're all going to gather outside Downing Street and demand an end to period poverty. And then he replied, because I think the word protest freaked him out a little bit. So in the end, the Free Periods protest happened that day, and over 2,000 teenagers assembled. Everyone was wearing red or carrying banners with kind of emblazoned with period puns. They all said, "We are not overreacting," or that kind of thing. And we had we had loads of amazing speakers, lots of politicians like Jess Phillips, Sharmi Chakrabarti, Paula Sheriff. We had real cross-party support, which was amazing. We also had a lot of celebrities, models, comedians like Aisling B, Adjara Boa, Suki Waterhouse, Daisy Lowe, a performance from a singer, chants where we had all these amazing teenage girls saying, "What do we want? Tampons. When do we want them? Sometime this month," which was really cool. And so, yeah, it was just, even though we were protesting something quite horrendous, it felt like more of a celebration of menstruation. There was a real sense of pride and enjoyment, and just a real sense of fun, which I think is something that's quite unique to the kind of teenage activist movement. And I think after that day, because it was trending on Twitter, Free Periods was, it was all on every single news channel, and it got huge media coverage. So I was quite naive. I was like, of course, the government will definitely, there'll be tampons everywhere after this, because this seems like the biggest deal ever right now. And nothing happened. We had a meeting a few weeks later where we kind of got through to a Conservative MP who pledged that she would give I think it was £1 million from the tampon tax budget, which is distributed to 10 different charities every year, because this is a huge other issue, which is a separate campaign, but we still pay tax on all period products because they're classed as a luxury item, where Jaffa cakes, for example, are classed in basic and essential items that aren't taxed. So it really doesn't make any logical sense.
No.
But in principle, because we can't get rid of it, because it's actually an EU tax, so it will be removed in the process of Brexit, but obviously not now. All the money that we have up till now paid on the tampon tax goes into a budget that's distributed to 10 women's charities. So this money, it was £1.5 million, went to a charity to address period poverty, but it wasn't a sustainable solution at all. It wasn't a long-term fix. It was kind of like a quick fix almost to stop the protesting. So that was quite disappointing, and the campaign continued over the course of 2018. I was really fortunate to be able to travel whilst doing my A-levels and try and spread the word of period poverty.
You're doing this while you're doing your A-levels then?
Yeah, in 2018.
Only slightly impressive.
So I was very lucky. I got to go to Washington, DC, New York, Johannesburg and Zambia, and talk about period poverty on a more international stage. But what felt really ironic and weird was that I was talking about this kind of idea of global period poverty, and I was meeting people from charities or even governments around the world who were shocked and outraged and pledged to do something about it. But our own government in the UK was still completely in denial and wouldn't really commit to anything long term. So that kind of obviously upset me, and I was also in the process of applying to university. And around this kind of time, was connected with a lawyer who's based in LA, but she's British and had lived there for the past 5 years. And she said, have you ever thought about legal action or kind of using the law to almost bolster your campaign? And obviously I had not, other than my 2 weeks at Leigh, I had no background in law and had no idea what that would entail. So at that point I kind of started talking to a few different lawyers. We started having a few meetings with law firms in London, and also teamed up with a couple of people from the Red Box Project, which is a charity that deals with period poverty in schools and distributes products. So at that point, at the end of 2018, Free Periods became a company limited by guarantee with a board of directors, and we started working very closely with these lawyers in preparation for a legal campaign, which we then launched in 2019. And for me, that moment was so transformative in that everyone, you know, nationally was started to take this issue far more seriously. The idea that we had a legal backing and the law behind us, I think really it really kind of changed the nature of the campaign and changed people's reactions to it. And I think people started to take what maybe was perceived as just a kind of angry little girl. I definitely went to Parliament and had meetings with MPs where nothing was said, but I could definitely feel that I wasn't being taken seriously sometimes.
Patronising. Yeah.
Exactly, because I kind of fit the bill of being a young woman of colour, and I don't think that's definitely not the majority demographic in the House of Commons. So that having the law and saying that, sorry, I didn't actually explain that our idea was that we would say that the Equality Act said in UK law says that all children should have equal access to education. And by this point, a lot of research into period poverty had been done that found that 1 in 10 girls in the UK had missed a day of school because they couldn't afford period products. And obviously, if you're a boy or you don't have a period, you don't have that same struggle, and you can go into any school toilet and access toilet paper, water and soap, whatever you need, whereas girls and people who do have periods just didn't have the same rights and access. So that's obviously a clear inequality that was stopping all children from having equal access to education. So that was the case. We started working with the lawyers, we started raising money for it and preparing, and within just 2 months of launching it, the government, it was Philip Hammond in a spring statement, made a pledge to end period poverty in all secondary schools, state-funded secondary schools in England. And at that point, it was obviously great. I couldn't believe it. It came completely out of nowhere. I literally saw a Guardian article on my phone that said he'd made this statement, and I didn't think it was true. And then we then kind of expanded our campaign to say that it should be primary schools too, because I started my period in primary school, and I don't think anyone really knows why. Let me know if you know why. But at this point, young girls are starting their period at an increasingly young age. So there's a significant proportion of girls who are on their period in primary school. So we said it should be expanded, and it was. And then we said, wait, also colleges, so sixth form colleges weren't initially included in the scheme. And so now all primary schools, secondary schools and state-funded colleges in the UK can get free menstrual products, which is obviously brilliant. And that started in January of 2020. The scheme obviously isn't perfect because it's an opt-in scheme, which means that each school individually has to sign up to receive the product. So they're all given the budget, but they're not guaranteed to get the products until they physically sign up. And take-up has been, over the course of 2020, because of all the various disruptions that 2020 has thrown at us, take-up is quite low. It's at 40% now. So 60% of schools in England have the ability to have free period products, but don't have them. And a lot of the time it's just not enough awareness. The government obviously aren't prioritising publicity around the period product scheme at a time like this. So I understand that, but that's why we're working really hard on launching a big campaign in October, when schools have kind of adjusted to being back, to start encouraging teachers and students also to really make a big deal out of this scheme, to take advantage of it, order the products that they need, and once they've ordered them, to make a big deal out of period education. Because one thing that I realised over the course of my campaign, and I do think the reason it took 2.5 years for it to even be addressed, was because the topic or the word periods just immediately scares people. You always see, particularly if they're a man or someone who doesn't have a period, they kind of shudder or like look at their feet or get their phone out and kind of, there is this huge widespread reluctance across people of all genders. Like I know girls who really can't even utter the word period or didn't tell their mums for 6 months after starting, just because of the shame. And that's something that we've really sadly all internalized. I'd definitely internalized it before I started free periods and started to kind of really unlearn all these patriarchal ideas that periods, because they only affect half of the population, that are coincidentally also marginalized and systematically disadvantaged in society, they are just kind of ignored and brushed under the carpet and not talked about in the way that we would talk about any other bodily process. It's a completely normal, natural, biological process, and it's also the reason that we're all here. It's the reason that we can
Exactly.
so we should really be celebrating them. And yeah, I always have this joke that, I mean, I was taught at school that a really kind of discreet way of storing or kind of transporting a tampon is to stuff it up your sleeve. And I think that was taught to me at the age of 10. And by telling young children that that's how you should, that should be your relationship with periods, you're telling them not to talk about them. But I always say we should just be waving them around in the air and use it.
You just don't care.
Exactly, because that's the only way that we can teach the next generation that this is not an embarrassing issue, and they need to be talked about in the same way that you would talk about what you had for dinner or anything else as normal as that. And it should be whether you have a period or you don't. I think I very probably too frequently kind of creep my brother out by giving him very graphic details of my periods, and of course it's kind of terrifying for him, but it's also really educational, because the half of the population who don't have periods are often just really curious, because there's this thing that the other half of the population go through, and the half that don't have periods have no clue, and they're going to affect you if you're one day going to be a father or a boyfriend or a husband. They will be a part of your life. So that's kind of the two facets of free periods, the period poverty side and the period taboo side. And we're currently raising funds to try and really work with schools very closely in trying to get the take up to 100% by the end of the year, because there is a fear that if a school hasn't signed up to the scheme and ordered products by the end of December, that they won't be allocated that budget in 2020.
And then it's gone.
And then it's gone. So we're trying to get in touch. It's a huge task, and I'm also about to start my 3rd year at Cambridge, so it's going to be a really busy couple of months for me, but we're trying to get in touch with every single school in the country and work with the education department and the PHS who are running the scheme to try and really publicize the scheme as widely as possible. So if you are able to donate, that would be incredible. And if anybody knows anyone who's at school, who's a teacher, who's a head teacher, just kind of talking about the scheme, talking about periods and the importance of having access to products as a human right is imperative. So yeah, thank you so much for listening, and it's very disconcerting not being able to see people's faces, isn't it? But yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you.
Amika, I'm pretty sure they did, and that's it's an amazing achievement. And to do it the young age that you are, and you're absolutely right about the awareness, and also the fact that there is period poverty, and it's just a brilliant achievement. I mean, your CV so far is ridiculous. And we were talking about hopefully she's going to be a future Prime Minister, because we certainly need a decent one at the moment. But we'll probably have some questions later on, if that's okay. But thank you, that was really interesting to hear how it came about. And from the other end of the spectrum, we've got Diane, who's going to just talk about menopause, which has just become a sexy thing, hasn't it, in terms of actually increasing awareness about that as well, because it's another taboo that everybody's not been talking about. People are too embarrassed. Women have suffering in silence, and of course Diane did an amazing campaign to increase awareness. And so thanks, Diane. If you could just tell us how that came about.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here alongside such an impressive young woman. Huge congratulations, Amika, on what you've achieved. It's absolutely amazing. So how menopause support and the campaign really came about was because of my own experience. So back in 2012, I had to have a total hysterectomy really quite quickly. And there was very little time for me to sort of become familiar with everything menopause. So I was 44 at the time, and menopause hadn't really crossed my mind, to be honest. But had to have this surgery, which was going to put me into an immediate surgical menopause. I didn't, unfortunately, have the right support from, you know, the medical professionals around me prior to my surgery. Nobody gave me the right information. And that didn't happen after my surgery either. So I was a woman essentially in early menopause, had gone into a state of estrogen deprivation very quickly, essentially overnight, by having my ovaries, my womb, my cervix all removed at the same time. And all I knew about menopause and HRT was pretty negative. Everything that I'd ever heard or read about HRT was pretty negative. There'd been lots of scare stories about it, etc. And my only advice on leaving the hospital was, when you feel better in about 6 weeks' time, when you've rested up from your surgery, go and see your GP. I really had no idea why I was going to see the GP, because I got absolutely no follow-up care from the hospital after having major abdominal surgery. So I thought I would probably have an opportunity to go back and speak to the team at the hospital, but that was never made available to me. So after about 6 weeks, I did go off to see the GP. And when she started to talk about, okay, so, you know, you'll need HRT, I pretty much said, no, thank you. And unfortunately, nobody even then talked to me about why it was so important for somebody in my situation who had had their ovaries removed. So essentially, that was the end of the conversation. I decided that I was going to see a nutritionist privately, see if they could help me. I was absolutely promised that they could. They prescribed me with several different types of herbs, vitamins, minerals, told me that, you know, that would really help. And to be fair, for the first 2 or 3 months after my surgery, I was just delighted not to have the original diagnosis of ovarian cancer confirmed. Wow. And to be told that my surgery had actually been done just in time. So I was very, very focused on getting back to work, on, you know, being delighted not to have had that diagnosis, and sort of thought I was doing okay. And probably about 3 months after my surgery, I started to develop symptoms. And for those of you who are familiar with anything menopause, you've probably heard about things like hot flushes and night sweats. To be honest, I didn't really experience those. I started to experience anxiety, panic, low moods, poor concentration, really struggling with not wanting to socialize. So I didn't want to see friends. I was really internalizing, got to the point where I didn't even want to walk my dogs, which was sort of my favorite thing to do in the world. Didn't really want to leave the house, was completely losing my confidence, didn't want to drive. And this progressed to the point where I was having panic attacks in the middle of the night. I was becoming incredibly low. The world started to feel like a very dark place. And I really genuinely thought that I was going mad. And it got to the point essentially where I had become a pretty non-functioning human being. I'd pretty much become a husk of the woman that I used to be. My husband was incredibly concerned. kept trying to get me to go back to the doctors, but I had heard a lot about women in a similar situation to me being put on antidepressants and left on them for the rest of their lives. I was terrified of that, so kept resisting. But it got to the point where he felt that he couldn't leave me at home alone anymore. So we actually had to get my mother to come and live with us for a while so that he could carry on going to work and doing all the normal things that people do, so that I had somebody there with me. And I felt, I felt that I couldn't really be alone. I had to have somebody with me, which is so far from the woman that I was before. And
how long was this going on for, Diane?
This went on for probably about 3 or 4 months.
It happened that quickly, just a drop in estrogen just happened.
Yeah, so about 3 months after my surgery, I started to develop these symptoms, which is actually when any kind of natural estrogen in my body would have just completely run out. So anything that was held anywhere would have completely run out. And I sort of dropped off a cliff, basically. As I say, I had stopped seeing friends. I'd stopped going out. I wouldn't answer the phone. I was terrified of opening the post, would you believe? And I can't really tell you how I got there or how this happened, because I hadn't driven for ages. But on one particular day, I found myself in my car with my 4 little dogs in the back, driving on a dual carriageway close to my home, and came incredibly close to putting my car in front of a lorry, because I just decided that life was really not worth living anymore. Oh. And the thing that stopped me was one of my little Jack Russells called Henry, who he barked at essentially the very moment, and it broke my train of thought. But it obviously, as it did break my train of thought, it hit me like a ton of bricks what I'd almost done. And I went into shock. Thankfully, it was not too far from home, managed to very slowly get home, and told my husband what I'd done. He then immediately contacted the doctors, took me back the same day. And it was the doctor that I saw was the first person in that time to explain to me why I felt like I felt, because I'd had this rapid depletion of estrogen, and how rapid depletion of estrogen affects our brain health as well as our physical health. And explained to me that absolutely I must have HRT, and that it was very different to the old type of HRT. It was now body identical, plant derived. And she was absolutely brilliant, because she kind of answered all the questions that should have been answered prior to my surgery. And had that have happened, I would never have got into that situation. But what it made me think was, well, if that's happened to me, have I been really unlucky, or has anybody else felt as though they're going mad, felt really alone, etc., etc.? So I started to search online, and obviously at the time, it was sort of 2013, it was probably a lot more about forums than it was about Instagram and Facebook groups, etc. But I found some forums where I found literally thousands of women saying things like, please help me, I think I'm going mad, I feel so alone, whatever is going on with me that I don't understand, I don't think I can hold my job down anymore, this is having a terrible effect on my relationship. And I thought, hang on a minute, if menopause happens to half the population, how can it possibly be that we're still in a situation where so many women are struggling? And at the time, I was really in no state to support anybody else or campaign or anything like it. But I said to my husband, if I ever feel well again, I'm going to make damn sure I do something to change this. And that was sort of the moment. And it took me quite a while to get the right help and support for me, because of my sort of medical history, I needed slightly different HRT to might be typical for somebody in my position. I was refused that a couple of times by my GP practice. I ended up having to consult a menopause specialist privately to get the right HRT for me. And again, I thought, hang on a minute, you know, that's fine. I'm in a very fortunate position to be able to afford to consult somebody privately. But what about all those women who just don't have that opportunity? That's not right. So because, you know, sort of because of what I do, as you said earlier, you know, my work is really about supporting people. I decided to do some professional nurse training in menopause so that I could combine that with my therapy work, so that I could more practically support women and talk them through their options, etc., so that they could feel more empowered when they went to their doctors. So I set up what was menopause support at the time, which was sort of, you know, a kitchen table venture. And then a little while later thought, okay, so let's set up something for everybody. So set up a Facebook group called the Menopause Support Network, which we have just under 17,000 members at the moment. And then in 2018 decided that this needed to be a national campaign, and that there were three clear areas that needed to be focused on. One was lack of healthcare professional training, specifically GPs, because for most women, their GP will be their first port of call when they're struggling with symptoms. The second one was to have greater support in the workplace, because I was hearing from so many women who were either considering leaving their jobs because of their symptoms, which were either untreated by their doctor, or perhaps they were not getting the right support in the workplace. And the third was to have menopause introduced into what was PSHE, which is now the new RSE curriculum in secondary education, because it became clear that we were talking about periods, we were talking about pregnancy, and menopause was nowhere to be seen. Well, in a woman's life cycle, menopause is very much part of it. Not every woman will become pregnant, will choose to be pregnant, or if they would like to become pregnant, will be able to. But every woman will experience menopause. And if we're not teaching young people about it, then at no time in a woman's life does she have any information about menopause drop through the door in the same way that we do for cervical smears or for breast screening. So essentially, in your late 30s, early 40s, when perimenopause symptoms come along, essentially, you have absolutely no information about it, because the likelihood is that your mother didn't talk about it. There's a huge social taboo around menopause, which in many places still exists. Depending on your cultural background, that taboo may be even greater. So the idea around it was that if we educate young people, at least they will have a basic understanding, both for themselves personally, but also to be able to have more understanding perhaps of mothers, grandmothers, family members. Most of us are going to go into the workplace at some point, so it makes sense for us to have a basic understanding to be able to better support our colleagues who are going through it. Half of us will go through it personally, the other half will be affected in some way, shape or form during their lives. So that was the idea there. Having greater support in the workplace is really, it's very sad to read surveys that tell us that 1 in 4 women consider leaving the workplace due to their menopause symptoms, which equates very well with the 1 in 4 who experience very debilitating symptoms of menopause, and then the 1 in 10 who actually do. So we're losing huge amounts of talent from the workplace. That goes on then to have an effect on the individual woman, on her family finances, on her self-esteem, on her self-confidence, but it also affects us more widely than that, because it affects the organisations, it leaves gaps in their talent. it also affects us as a society, because we have then women who perhaps don't feel that they're able to come back into the workplace. When we consider that women over 50 are the fastest growing demographic in the workplace currently, with more than 4.4 million women over 50 in the workplace, it's just common sense that we offer support there to those women. And then around the GPs, sadly, GPs don't currently have mandatory training in menopause. I've taken this up many times with the Royal College, who insist that it's in the curriculum. And my reply to that would be, well, I think your curriculum needs looking at, because it's clearly not being taught to all of them. And it's also unfair on healthcare professionals not to equip them with the education that they're going to need for half of the population. So for me,
something that's going to happen
win-wins
to half the population as well. It's just a matter.
Yeah. It's, for me, it's all about, you know, very much as Amika was speaking about, it's common sense. You know, why have these things not been done before? And, you know, thankfully people are raising them now, which is where we need to be. So because I have spoken out about my own personal experience quite extensively, I've done quite a lot of TV, etc. And after one TV interview, the MP Carolyn Harris got in touch with me and said, would you come into Westminster? I'd really like to meet you to speak about this. She's been incredibly supportive. She's raised it in the House. You know, menopause has very rarely been raised as a question in the House of Commons. I think I can probably count on the fingers of one hand how often it's been raised. Generally, most of those fingers are in the last couple of years as a result of what's been going on. I then met with the MP Rachel McLean, who has also been incredibly supportive, and then Paula Sheriff. So as Amika said, you know, we've had cross-party support. We actually launched the campaign in Westminster on the 18th of October in 2018, which is World Menopause Day, so coming up again soon. And less than a year later, in July 2019, we had information from the Department of Education that menopause was going to be included into the RSE curriculum. More recently, because essentially I've been trying to run the campaign and menopause support, etc., with the help of a couple of fabulous volunteers who look after the group for me, I've now formed menopause support into a not-for-profit community interest company so that we can look to raise funds, because what we really need to do is we really need to be providing good quality, factual, evidence-based information to schools for their curriculum, because it's fine to have it on the curriculum, but it needs to be taught appropriately, and young people need to have the right information. We would very much like to be able to produce information packs that women can take along to their GPs, so that even if they're not being educated correctly, we can actually provide them with factual, evidence-based information. And also to be able to provide more resources for workplaces so that women can be supported. Because for me, I don't think there's any point in flagging up the issues if you haven't got any answers. And so we want to be able to provide some of those resources. So, you know, consequently, going forward as a not-for-profit was the best way to go forward. But essentially, you know, it's very much along the same lines as what Amika was saying. You know, periods, menopause, they're not a women's issue. They're an issue for everybody. And, you know, actually doing something about this is not just a win-win for now, it's a win-win for the future. And I certainly don't want the next generation of women to experience menopause the way that many of them are experiencing it at the moment.
I mean, it is really astonishing. And also just, I mean, there's doctors are women as well. And the fact that, you know, they must be alive to this, yet it's still so undersold. And I mean, are there any guidelines? And, you know,
yeah. Yeah,
the Royal College of, RCOG should be all over this in guidelines. And
so we have NICE guidelines. We have NICE guidelines on menopause, which came up for the first time in 2015. So for the first time in history, we had NICE guidelines on menopause in 2015. So that shows you, sort of just how behind the curve historically we've been to be producing national guidelines for our medical healthcare professionals on menopause for the first time 5 years ago. So the RCOG do have some guidelines, but the problem is that everybody needs to be pulling together in the same direction. And I understand what you're saying, Suzanne, about women are doctors too. But if you're a woman if you're in your 20s or 30s and menopause hasn't crossed your personal radar and you've not been educated about it, you probably don't even recognize it, because very often the first symptoms to present are the cognitive and psychological symptoms. They're not the physical symptoms. So it is things like anxiety, low mood, what people might call depression. And, as there have been surveys done which show that, 60 to 70% of women who present with those symptoms in their perimenopause, and for many women, perimenopause starts in the early 40s. Menopause is very much still thought of as something that happens to women in their 50s, but your perimenopause can happen in your late 30s, early 40s. Yeah, absolutely. So many of those women go along to the doctor, talk about being anxious, low mood, perhaps they might call themselves depressed, and consequently they're offered antidepressants. Antidepressants are absolutely not first line. A really simple thing to do, would be for every GP to go through a menopause symptom checker with any woman who's over the age of 40, who comes in with a handful of symptoms that she doesn't really understand where they're coming from. So obviously, unless there's a different clinical diagnosis, but if there is no other clinical diagnosis, a really simple thing would be, let's go through a checklist, let's look at where you are, because the symptoms can be so varied. They can be physical, psychological, emotional, cognitive symptoms. So the problem is we have this huge knowledge void, this huge void of information, because if the woman doesn't know and doesn't recognize it herself, and the GP doesn't recognize it, then the woman ends up going away either with nothing or with antidepressants, which is not the right thing for estrogen depletion. The GP hasn't learned anything, and nor has the patient. And, I would love to tell you that nobody is going through what I went through today. I would love to tell you that nobody who goes into surgical menopause has the lack of information that I had, but I can't, because I have hundreds of women on my group who have been through exactly the same experience and have had no information prior to their surgery, no information post-surgery, no surgery follow-up, and they go off to their GP, who, if the woman is very young, even if she's had her ovaries removed, I've had women come back to me and say, I've had my ovaries removed, but my doctor says that because I'm in my 30s, it can't be menopause. Well, that's just physiology. That's just basic physiology. There is such a job to do here to improve education. But the difficulty is that when you approach, as I say, when you approach Royal Colleges, and of course the RCGP are responsible for the curriculum, they're not responsible for teaching it. It's taught at, I think we now have 22 medical schools around the country. All those medical schools teach a slightly different curriculum. So you will hear about doctors who had, I went to do a refresher for second year medical students on menopause at my local university, which is a medical school. They were second year students, so I wanted to, sort of treat them with respect about their knowledge. And when I started to talk to them about menopause, they said, we've never heard any of this because we saw 8 slides about it. So, you know, for me, I think it's really unfair to GPs not to equip them with the information that they need, but it's equally unfair for the women who are going to seek their support. And consequently, you know, sort of, as I say, this leads to relationship breakdown. It leads to women leaving their jobs.
Catastrophic. It's
For me,
catastrophic.
the biggest and the saddest and the most disgraceful hidden cost of all this is that if you look at any of the figures from the ONS, you will regularly see that the highest risk for suicide amongst women is between the ages of 45 and 54. And, you know, I think if there's a headline out there, that's the one that we should be talking about, is that, you know, sort of women get so desperate that they just simply do not know where to turn.
Well,
so much work to be done.
I think that's right, and it's just kicked off so big styly because it's just all over the place now, and rightly so. I mean, obviously, the angle of, I mean, the economic impact, as you say, is just phenomenal, because you've got women who are coming back to work after having kids, or, I mean, back to full-time work potentially.
Yeah.
So they're senior in their positions. They've got something to give, you know, that they can really contribute, and yet they go through this process that people just fob off, don't take seriously, and it has these massive consequences for women's health. There's a big way to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the medical profession do need to educate themselves. I really do think so. And the cases that I've got is, you know, obviously just not informing the patient, not being on top of it. And it's anyway, well done. You've done a great job, and it's really getting out there. The message is really getting out. So I've got I mean, we haven't got that long, but we've got some questions to ask. Lots of compliments on how excellent both the presentations are, just from the, you know, teenage dynamic, and then of course from the sort of middle-aged dynamic about, you know, menstrual health and stuff. So we've got loads of compliments about that. Such an impressive presentation, fantastic presentation. One from Pauline, Amika, is your campaign wider than England? If not, are there similar campaigns in other nations?
Yeah, great question. So obviously period poverty isn't exclusive to England at all. It happens all over the world. And my campaign was initially focused on just England. And now we've kind of, although as I said, the scheme is quite flawed, we've achieved our aim in persuading the government to create this policy. Our next step in terms of England is to get that enshrined in law, because I'm constantly terrified that the next government can come in and just scrap the scheme, because it's not a law. But in terms of outside of England, Scotland kind of have always been sort of ahead of the game on period poverty. They were providing products in schools before my campaign started in England, actually. And in Wales and Northern Ireland, in Wales there are products in schools now. In Northern Ireland there's an ongoing campaign for that, which you can find more details about online, and we're Free Periods are supporting that, but it's a separate group. In terms of across Europe, I think the situation is different, because period poverty definitely happens, but it's extremely it's not talked about enough, and it's under researched, so there's no statistics and there's no sense of the extent or the scale of how bad period poverty is. And only recently, kind of I'd say in the last year or so, there have been campaigns started across Germany and Spain, and I'm kind of contacted by a lot of groups saying that they'd like to collaborate with Free Periods. And I think our approach has always been that we will help and expand, but we don't, I mean, I don't think it's the same situation across the world. In the kind of idea that I could start this petition and persuade the UK government to create this policy, especially outside of Europe. I think the context is very different, so I'm very aware of kind of imposing our own campaigning strategy in another country. But having said that, I was very lucky to go to Zambia in summer last year and see the impact of charities there who've been tackling period poverty and starting menstrual hygiene schemes, where they basically teach teachers and students and families and community members to sew these reusable period products in about 20 minutes, and they're made of this very thin kind of cotton material. You can make it in 20 minutes and they last 2.5 years. And for me, going back to what I said at the beginning of my presentation about this idea of the UK being a developed country compared to other less developed or developing,
They're way ahead.
They're way ahead because those are so sustainable, much more environmentally friendly, and we're all still pretty much all using disposable products still. So it's a very different environment. And so I've always been supportive of campaigns across the world and encouraging people to talk about periods and to talk about period poverty, and encouraging governments and campaigners and charities to collaborate in ending period poverty, particularly for schools. In terms of Europe, though, my kind of long-term aim after we launch the legal campaign in this country is to expand that across Europe, and kind of demand that it becomes an EU law that period products should be provided for free in all schools and colleges across the EU, which one day I think needs to happen, but I'm not sure quite how that works in terms of Brexit.
You need to get in touch with Michel Barnier quickly.
Yeah,
Part of the free trade agreement. I think you should just tap. I think he'd be very happy to listen to you, Amika, frankly. That's one question. Diane, do you have any info on how long it takes for estrogen to deplete when you are naturally post-menopause? Have you got any idea about that?
So from your first symptom to your last perimenopausal symptom and to the end of periods, so officially menopause is 12 months and 1 day without a period. Over that time, that on average takes between 4 and 8 years. So you could be perimenopausal at 43 and become menopausal at 51. And during that time, your estrogen is essentially doing this, kind of going up and down all over the place, and then eventually it will settle out at a very low level, around 1% of what you would have produced before.
Okay. Really important issues. Thank goodness women like Diane and Amika have the drive and determination to effect change. Congratulations both. So I've got another one, which is a friend had an op in her 40s in the last year and was given no information other than she couldn't have HRT because of the risk of cancer. Well, that's a difficult one. I guess we didn't talk about the fact that women are put off HRT because of the kind of risk of cancer, and I think we talked about that at our last women's event, and the impact of HRT, and it's important to get all the information so you can properly consent it.
I think the thing is, it's going to depend on the individual's medical history, but ultimately there's been an awful lot of scare stories, myths and misinformation about HRT, which came out of a study that was ended prematurely in 2002 called the WHI, the Women's Health Initiative. We've just had the 18-year follow-up to that, which shows that for the vast majority of women, HRT benefits hugely outweigh the risks. Obviously, it has to be individualized, but even women who have had certain types of cancer, in a one-to-one conversation with a menopause specialist, might still elect to use hormone replacement therapy to improve their quality of life. And that's essentially what the conversation should always be about. It should always be about ultimately patient choice, and it should be about their quality of life. It shouldn't be about having the clinician's opinions imposed.
Make a decision for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the risk should be really, clear to the patient. So if it's a really minor risk, but and there's other risks, of course, with the osteoporosis and other issues that are much more detrimental to health, that women need to be able to have informed choice about. I've got another one here from Mary. As many of the symptoms you described are generic, not specific to menopause, what do you think what's your view on the best approach by GPs?
So as I said, I think the thing is, for most GPs, they know their patients anyway. So they know their patient's medical history. Ideally, we would have GPs who are educated to recognise the symptoms, but most GPs should know that for most women, their perimenopause is going to start in their early 40s. If a patient appears who doesn't come to see you very often, who is talking about having a host of what seem like disconnected symptoms, because this is the other thing. Many women talk about, they're now told you can talk about one issue in a consultation, and they maybe have 7 different symptoms. They maybe have problems with dry eyes, they might have their periods changing slightly, hot flushes, anxiety, itchy skin, etc., etc. If you're told you can only talk about one of those at a time, but if somebody comes with a handful of symptoms, then a really simple thing to do would be to say, what's going on with your periods? Because it could be that their periods, they might not have stopped, but they could have changed. And then let's look at a symptom checker together, just to see if this could be perimenopause, because the likelihood is it probably is going to be that.
I mean, it's interesting because the first thing the GP thinks, you know, if there's, are your periods regular? Are you pregnant? How they can't have that work through process when you're, you know, sort of in your 40s, and it actually is it menopause? Can we just think about that as well? It just seems logical.
Yeah.
Look, we're nearly up to an hour now, so well, actually over an hour. We've got just one sort of last question. Both brilliant talks. Fantastic to look at women's life experience from periods to post-menopause. How, I guess it's a good question to both of you, how can we all help you spread the word with both of these campaigns? Is there anything we can do as women to help you? What do you think is the best way for both of you?
Amika, go on, you go first, lovely.
Well, yeah, I mean, I always kind of say the first thing is just talking about it, and I think Diane would agree, just starting that conversation in order to break the stigma and normalize it as a topic of everyday conversation. Whether you're someone who's directly affected by menopause or periods, it should be a conversation that really includes everyone, and it should be an empowering conversation rather than an embarrassing one, because that's what I think holds us back. In terms of free periods, we always are asking for donations if possible to try and really launch this campaign to get as many schools signed up to the scheme as possible. And as I said before, getting any schools involved, and just checking that students are also aware of the scheme, and lobbying for more period education and empowering period education as well. Those are kind of the main asks. Of course, follow us on social media. We also recently launched a new campaign called Free Period Stories, trying to encourage people to tell embarrassing, honest, funny, awkward period stories online, because I feel like we've all got one, at least one. So just posting them on social media.
One. I think I was actually thinking about sending, because my daughter just left sixth form, and I actually didn't have time, but I was just thinking we should be sending the webinar out to maybe sixth form colleges and schools, so that that kids can watch it if they want to. Yeah. And I'm I think that probably is a good idea, actually.
Really great.
Diane, just to finish off.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about it. When somebody asks you what you've been doing today, talk about what you've seen, talk about what you've learnt. Talk about it as often as you can, whether it's within your family situation, whether it's in your workplace, etc., because it normalizes it. The more that we talk about these things, the more it normalizes it. As far as menopause support's concerned, the campaign, I think we have just under 120,000 signatures on the petition. We would love to have more, so I would be delighted if you would go and sign and share the Make Menopause Matter campaign. It's on Change, but you can find it via menopausesupport.co.uk. As I said earlier, we're looking very much at filling this information gap with education for the general public, for medical health professionals, and also for employers. So if you know of any resources that we could access, and I'm sure Amika would absolutely love to have the same. If you know of any resources that we can access that can help us do that, that would be great. If you work for an employer where you feel that they should be focusing on both of these issues, then do get in touch, because as I said, we do provide educational webinars and things. And if there's anything that, if you're somebody who's struggling with menopause yourself, please do come and join the Facebook group. You'll be very welcome there. There are lots of resources on the Menopause Support website. And if you know any influencers and change makers for either of us who can help us move these things forward, then I'm sure, we'd both be delighted if you get in touch.
Thank you.
And I think awareness is obviously key. I mean, what the last point to make is that because appointments are being cut and it's difficult to see GPs, awareness, you know, just between women and, you know, support groups is a huge thing at this present time with the pandemic on.
Absolutely.
But anyway, look, massively impressed by both of you. Thank you so much. Brilliant campaigns, so important. As I say, I'm expecting Amika to be Prime Minister, hopefully. Diane, maybe Deputy. But I can't thank you enough. And it was a brilliant session. And we're going to send it out on YouTube if you guys want to put it out there as well, because I think it's a great session to see the comparing of teenage health and middle-aged health. So thank you both very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care now.